Hello, good evening. Welcome to the David Ellis Show. Tonight we're going to be looking at lawfare. What is that? Lawfare is a term that General David Petraeus coined back in 2018 when he was discussing the detrimental aspects of European human rights legislation and how that's completely turned on its head how the British Army, Navy and Air Force, our armed services, used to conduct warfare under the Geneva Convention. We'll be talking to Dennis Hutchings, a British Army veteran who served in Northern Ireland, who now faces, decades on from serving in the 1970s, a charge of attempted murder. Dennis is facing a trial in February next year without a jury. We want to look at how this is impacting Britain's armed forces on not just recruitment, retention, and how their future fighting capability is clearly going to be impacted by this if it isn't resolved. Earlier today, I spoke to Dennis Hutchings and I asked him how, decades on, he found himself on a murder charge despite having a letter from Her Majesty's government saying he had no case to answer.
It all started basically 74 when the incident happened. It was investigated by both the RUC, as it was at the time, and the RMP Special Branch. They carried, both of them, I think it was a joint investigation that they carried out. And then sometime in, I think it was January 1975, I was called into the office by my commanding officer that they'd received this letter from the Ministry of Defence regarding the incident and there would be no further action. So that was fine by me. I just carried on soldiering, and I left the army in 1985. And I think the next time I heard anything about it was 2013, when a gentleman from what they called the HET, the Historical Examinations Team, which had been set up by the government to investigate killings in Northern Ireland. Apparently, the guy told me they were investigating both sides, the military side, killings by the military, and killings by the terrorists. And would I be prepared to be interviewed? And I said, yes, I would. I didn't mind, as long as I had legal representation. And he said, yeah, that's fine. I said, do you want me to, they were based in Belfast. I said, do you want me to come to Belfast or are you going to come here? He said, well, we'll sort it out and we'll come back to you. I said, okay. So I rang the MOD and told them what was happening. And they put me on to Devonshire solicitors, which I'm still dealing with now. And they said they would deal with the HET. And it was in 2000 and I think 15. Eventually, they had numerous contacts with the HET, purely via emails and etc. And the HET had come back to the solicitors and said they'd investigated the incident. There was no new evidence to warrant any going forward. And they would be informing the PPS of Northern Ireland. My solicitors informed me, and I think, well, that's the bloody end of it, thank Christ. And 6 weeks later, I had 18 policemen turn up at my door.
18?
18, yeah.
18 policemen?
Yeah.
So there's you, who else is in the house?
My missus, her sister, her mum and dad, two of the children, grandchildren, they're all down on holiday.
Astonishing.
Yeah.
It's an unannounced, just arrived.
Totally unannounced.
Right.
And there was a guy, my sister went out first, sister-in-law went to the door because I was in the kitchen trying to do breakfast for everybody.
Right.
When she came in, she said, there's some gentlemen want to speak to you. I think they're from the local, she said, party, one of the parties, she said, because at that time the local elections were taking place.
Right.
So I said, okay, I'll go out and get rid of them. And I went outside, and this guy introduced himself, Detective Sergeant McCaw, from the PSNI in Northern Ireland. And he was here to arrest me on suspicion of the murder of John Pat Cunningham. So I invited them into the house. The police, there was another big party of police, and he said, Sergeant McCall told me that they were here to search the house. And I said,
search the premises?
Yeah. And I said, what for? He said, in case you've kept any diaries. And
had they got a warrant?
Yeah.
And they showed it to you?
Yeah. Well, they showed it to my missus, actually, because she made him take the shoes and boots off and all that.
Well done there.
And then I took the Northern Ireland party, of which I think there was 5, into the sitting room, and I said, right, well, before we go do anything else, I'm going to ring my solicitors.
Yeah, sure.
So they were very helpful, and I said, no, you carry on. So I did that. I rang Devonshire's, spoke to them, and I said, do you know what's happening? And I said, I've got the police here from Northern Ireland and Devon and Cornwall, and I think they could be from anywhere else, to arrest me, take me back to Northern Ireland regarding the incident in 1974. And they said, we know nothing about this. I said, well, you know, that's what they're here for. And I put them on to Sergeant McCaw, and they spoke, and then come back to me and said, right, we'll be back to you shortly. We'll just try and check this thing in depth. Anyway, the police said, look, we've got to take you now. So they allowed me to pack a bag. The police had been in and searched the house. Couldn't find nothing. It was normal. Packed my bag, and then they took me into their Land Rover and got on the road. We were going to, I think it was Bristol Airport we were going to. Anyway, they told me that I hadn't had any breakfast or anything, so did I know a good cafe? I said, well, there is one just up the road. So we went in there for breakfast. They were all sat having breakfast and asked me if I wanted any, and I didn't. And while they were having their breakfast, I just got up and left the table and said, where are you going? I said, I'm going for a cigarette. Oh, yeah, all right. They were very good. And then it took me to Bridgewater, lodged me in a cell there for most of the afternoon, and then took me to Bristol, and we flew back to Belfast. And then from there, they took me to Antrim Police Station, and I was held there for 4 days, questioned 26 times, interviewed 26 times, so about 16 more than Shipman had.
Wow.
In it.
Were they one interview team or multiple interview teams?
No, one interview team.
Right.
And then on the Friday, that was on the Tuesday, and on the Friday, they around about 7 or 8 o'clock. I think it was the chief inspector or something like that, came in and said that they'd reduced the charge from murder to attempted murder. And I'll be going to court on Saturday morning. And in the meantime, they'd book me into the hotel across the road. So then I went to the court. The magistrate, my barrister, spoke to him and asked for anonymity. And he agreed, apparently. And we came back into court, and the first thing he asked me was, are you Dennis Hutchings? There was loads of press in the court. So I looked at my barrister and I said, and he went. So the judge said, or the magistrate, whatever he was, said, I'll ask you once more. If you don't answer, you're treating the court with contempt. So he asked me again, are you Dennis Hutchings? I said, yes, I am. And are you from, and he gave out my address.
Good Lord.
Yeah. Anyway, we said yes, and then went through the details, and then it was, then I was remanded on bail because the police had no objections to bail, I said. I was remanded on bail, and then I made numerous appearances at various courts. Yeah, and here we are where we are today.
Yeah. So they wanted to appear remotely via computer video link?
That was only a later option. Prior to that, I had to attend.
To attend.
Yeah. It was only because of when my kidneys collapsed and that they did mention it, but I don't want a video link.
No.
If I'm going to go to court, I'm going to court.
You see, my understanding of that, Dennis, is that really, under an attempted murder charge, your right is that you're entitled to a jury. And you're currently, or you, as it stands, only going to get a judge. You're not going to get a jury.
That's correct.
Is that how they're wanting to play it?
That's what the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom decided. I could not believe that they reached that decision.
Yeah, quite.
Me being an ex-soldier, having served my country for 26 years, and I was just asking for my rights.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court turned me down
And
set a precedent,
yeah,
so that any other veteran or service personnel going through the courts of Northern Ireland will have a judge-only trial.
This is crucial. How many other servicemen are potentially in this situation?
At the moment, there's 5 going through the courts, 5 other cases, and there's 231 other cases sitting on the desk waiting to be
Sitting
opened.
in the wings.
Yeah,
That's how I understand it as well.
it's an absolute disaster.
So if they get away with this, with the first 5, the chances are they'll proceed to the
Of course they will.
200.
It's all part of the new HIU agreement, as you know,
Yeah.
which everybody has been talking about, and as various people are objecting to it on a large scale because it will create all sorts of problems. If they were looking at both sides, terrorist side and the service side, I've got nothing against standing in court. I'm innocent. I know I'm innocent. You know, they, in fact, I think, know I'm innocent. But this is all political.
Political. It's highly political.
It's got nothing to
no,
do with
it's-
it. Since I've been to the Supreme Court, I now realise that where the law is supposed to be separate from politics,
It isn't.
it is totally false.
Not at this level. There's too many big overlapping issues.
Yeah.
So with the Good Friday Agreement that Tony Blair concluded, I understand that veterans were excluded from that arrangement, and there was, as we've spoke about, I'm told that there was a warning from John Reid not to exclude the veterans, but
That's
Tony
right.
Blair proceeded regardless.
That's right. There is, and I'm sure it was John Reid that told him that he was treading on thin ice by excluding the veterans or service people from as part of this agreement, which is what Sinn Féin wanted, obviously. But he obviously ignored that advice, but he could ignore it because he didn't even take it in front of Parliament.
So this sort of carries on with the letters that a lot of the IRA terrorists have had, giving them essentially a get out of jail free from Tony Blair.
Well, we know how that system of the letters can be misinterpreted, as in the Downey case. Very convenient that he suddenly got a letter. Didn't have one before he was, as far as I'm aware.
So how come your no case to answer letter is not valid, but their letters are?
That's the politicians.
It's a political. Well, we're back to the big end of the politics, aren't we?
Yeah.
I kind of want to bring in something that Major General Lawfare Hockley pointed out to me, which was, I think, highly relevant with this, and this was comments made by General David Petraeus appertaining to what he called lawfare. And there were several key points that Petraeus wanted to highlight, and that was that the current lawfare situation, i.e. the legal framework that Britain and Britain's servicemen now find itself in, and you find yourself in, has several detrimental factors that could impact our fighting capability, morale, recruitment, retention. And the concluding comment, which I found rather chilling, was that he was saying that it could potentially have an impact on future UK, US fighting arrangements, because under the current law framework, he would say that we would have difficulties with targeting an active service. So from your point of view, Dennis, you as an ex-serviceman being pursued now in this absolutely abhorrent situation, how do you feel that that impacts anybody looking to want to sign up now and anybody that wants to stay in? You know, they obviously must be watching what's going on and thinking, well, if they can do that to you, could they do that to me?
Well, it is definitely happening. I've spoken to a lot of serving people when I've attended various regimental dues, and there is a great feeling there that what the hell are we going to do? How are we supposed to do it if we have to worry about the law, 20, 30 years later?
Yes.
Or 40 years in my case.
Yes.
And there is a strong feeling there. And I mean, I know lads who've left because they said it's just not the same anymore. It never will be the same anymore. And as I said before, servicemen are not ones for wanting to break the law.
No.
That's not what we do.
Far from it.
But we would like to be treated the same as everybody else within the law. And simple as that. But I'm afraid with the government we've got and the previous governments we've had over the last few years, 15, 20 years, they've just totally, as far as the veterans are concerned, thrown them to the wolves.
I think Petraeus hit some very, very important factors here. That he was saying that previously to EU human rights legislation impacting in Britain, because we were part of the EU and we're supposed to be leaving, that the warfare, lawfare was under the Geneva Convention. And the arrangement is completely upside down with the European Court of Human Rights. That where the first option, I think he articulates it beautifully, the first option under the Geneva Convention for military is, that you get to shoot the enemy in essence. And in the European framework of lawfare, it's the last option. So my question is, if you were going to fight with the EU, would you fight under their legal framework?
I'm not sure I would, to be quite honest, because what it is, and if I can put this rather bluntly,
good,
it's politicians covering their arses, their backsides, for what may happen in the future. And it's blatantly obvious, even now, with what's happening over the Banner, Northern Ireland. It's, politicians. These 99% of the politicians sat in that house, of the 650 of them, plus the House of Lords, have never, ever been in a situation where you have seconds to make decisions. But it's not just for your life, but it's the lives of the people
around you.
Yeah. And whether that could be civilians or it could be comrades, where you have to make decisions like that.
Yeah.
And they just don't understand that, to be quite honest.
Is it they don't understand or they don't want to?
Well, they don't want to.
They don't want to. Some time ago, Johnny Mercer was questioning the Permanent Secretary, Stephen Lovegrove, in Defence Select Committee. And he made some very interesting points about that the Permanent Secretary there had the tools to deal with this. And there was a delay. This was back some years. And whilst obviously he's now the Minister in charge of Veterans Affairs, in effect, We've had this gambit from the current Conservative government to deal with this within 100 days. That period has now come and gone, and we're still in this situation of not having this resolved. So do you see the blockage as weak ministers or as the civil service? Where do you see the actual problem laying?
I think both, to be quite honest. I think very weak ministers who people can't make decisions anymore. They just won't make their own individual decisions. You know, they've got to go and consult with, in 99% of these cases, I guarantee, you know, not 100%, but before they make any decision, they have to speak to the Northern Ireland office, because the Northern Ireland office is so closely linked to Sinn Féin, and everybody knows that nothing can be done about Northern Ireland without their say-so. And that's been going on for years and years and years. And people have made their names out of working for the Northern Ireland office, quite honest.
But this sort of not dealing with this issue and sort of the attitude there, and as Petraeus has said, and I'm sure our own senior officers are saying it as well, and even guys at the coalface will be saying this, not dealing with this affects our fighting capability.
No, I'm totally, to be quite honest, I am very, very disappointed. You mentioned, you know, our serving officers, and they've done nothing.
Why do you think they're so quiet?
Because they're hoping to get into the House of Lords one day.
Peerage. Well, there's one or two already have.
Yeah. I mean, they do talk about it quite openly and everything once they've left the positions. But to be quite honest, it's now they should be leading the soldiers.
Well, it's quite correct.
And the service people.
Yeah.
You know, the admirals, the chief marshals and the generals. They should be leading and telling the government.
But they're not.
But they're not.
See, I wonder whether the other agenda is, you know, the future defence union and these multilateral defence agreements. And
Yeah.
I think we spoke about this once or twice before about Mr. Trump's comments about the sort of payment situation with NATO being really unsatisfactory in Europe. And even before he was a candidate, he'd stated that NATO was dead. Do you think that there's potential, if he's re-elected, that he would change the NATO goalposts or withdraw from NATO?
I'm absolutely convinced 100% he will.
So if he withdraws from NATO, where does that leave us?
And I think that most of our politicians and the European politicians realise that. And that's why our forces, services have been reduced dramatically over the last few years. And I believe it's all part of they're going to form this new European services.
European Defence Union.
European Defence Union. Yeah.
Okay.
And we will contribute something like 50,000.
So we would be a component within, not
Yeah.
an independent national fighting force.
Exactly.
Because we're not capable.
Because we're not capable.
Do you think 500,000 British service personnel that have sworn allegiance to the Crown and the Queen and their successors would serve for the EU?
No.
Just unequivocally no.
No.
And now we find ourselves in a new defence review situation under Mark Sedwell, head of national security, who's going to be leaving in September, conducting a defence review prior to David Frost concluding the EU future deal. Does that make sense to you?
It does in a way. It's a backwards. They're going round and, you know, in and out the back door on all these things, to be quite honest. And they're trying to keep it as closed shop as they possibly can until such times as it'll be announced. Now, I don't think it would be announced any time in the next 2 to 3 years, but it's definitely coming.
Do you think we could potentially, under whatever this review is, see, well, I'm going to say it's unification, but they'll pitch it as cuts. Do you think we could potentially see more cuts to the armed services?
Yeah.
We could?
Yeah.
Which would reduce our capabilities even further?
Even further.
Do you think that would suit the future unified forces?
It would suit Russia and people like that.
Well, it would, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Dennis, I've got to thank you very, very sincerely for your time and trouble.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
We're now going to listen to General David Petraeus, former American commander in Iraq and Afghanistan, speaking at the Policy Exchange in 2018 on the issue of lawfare and how the rules of engagement previously under the Geneva Convention that the British Armed Forces fought under is steadily being displaced under the European Convention of Human Rights, and how that is creating an enormous amount of friction between how the American armed services fight and how the British Armed Forces fight.
My concern is with the negative connotation, that is with lawfare as an abuse of legal processes and international forums. Because of that development, today we face increasing friction between basic principles informing the two main reference legal frameworks within which military operations take place. On the one hand, under the Geneva Convention, which codified the law of armed conflict, lethal force is allowed as a matter of first resort against a clearly identified enemy. On the other hand, under the European Convention of Human Rights, lethal force is to be used only as a last resort and only in exceptional circumstances. Today, this friction has increased here in the UK because the law of armed conflict is being steadily displaced by European human rights law. As a state party to the European Convention of Human Rights, the United Kingdom is thus subject to a different legal regime from the one that applies to the U.S. military. Created in the post-World War II era, the European Convention of Human Rights was conceived as a safeguard against despotism. Yet the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has increasingly understood these rights in a more expansive fashion, treating the convention as a living instrument and gradually extending its application from domestic situations to the battlefield. This has affected the way military operations are conducted by some forces, giving rise to legal interoperability issues and also to new judicial pursuits against British soldiers and veterans. Understandably, this is having a chilling effect on recruiting, retention, and the overall morale of British Armed Forces. This evolution has been somewhat subjective and unpredictable, and it has increasingly made extensive litigation a reality for British soldiers who used force in a combat situation, even if they were complying with the law of armed conflict. As was clear in Afghanistan, this can undermine the British military's capacity to detain enemy combatants and to work with others, including the Afghan government and NATO allies. As a result, we see today in the United Kingdom an increasing number of investigations and a public perception that military leaders down to fairly low levels could end up in the dock for actions and decisions they've taken in the heat of battle in compliance with the law of armed conflict and national rules of engagement. Even more worrisome, some cases are going back not just a few years, but a number of decades. It goes without saying that these cases may not just cost the UK Ministry of Defence large sums of money, they inevitably also cause enormous stress and anxiety for those involved in prolonged and tendentious investigations. This unfortunate trend contrasts with the way the United States deals with the conduct of military operations in compliance with the law of armed conflict. The very special relationship between our two militaries, which has been built over decades of serving shoulder to shoulder in the hardest tests of battle, could be put at risk by the present situation. I fear that an overly expansive interpretation of the European Convention of Human Rights could place the UK in an untenable position, where British forces have to fight under a different legal framework than that of United States forces, potentially limiting the use of force by the British Armed Forces engaged in combat, targeting activities, and detention operations.
Also speaking at that Policy Exchange event on lawfare was Johnny Mercer MP. And he very importantly mentions a 2-page telling off pushback letter that he got from Permanent Secretary at the MOD, Stephen Lovegrove. And now look at the clip that provoked that response.
If you're sat there as a young man or woman or an older veteran, right, there's a guy who lives down my way, 77 years old, okay, charged with murder. Everybody else who was there is dead. He's got liver cancer. He will die before he goes to court, charged with murder. Thank you for your service.
I think you should be under no illusion about how seriously the Ministry of Defence takes its obligations to serving men and women who have given incredible service over many, many years. I'm not going to comment on individual cases, but we are absolutely going out of our way to give them as much possible support as we possibly can.
I should hope so too, Stephen.
Yes.
That is the crux of the problem here, is that the horse is bolted. These guys' lives have been trashed. 2 years ago, when you were the Permanent Secretary, you had the chance to look at that IHAT thing, and forgive me, but if you look at that report and you think my department got everything right, I think we may be in different ballparks. Do you not accept there was anything wrong with that process? And if not, why did you not then decide to
the IHAT
address
process
this?
was closed down at the moment at which it was appropriate to close it down. As I say, the IHAT process had to go through the processes that it did. It was directed by Parliament, which you will, I am sure, remember.
So it was a coincidence that after that prolonged campaign that I personally ran, we then did an inquiry here. We highlighted some appalling treatment, and it was closed down 36 hours later. That is just a coincidence. That was always the plan. Is that what you're saying?
It was closed down at an appropriate moment. That's what I'm saying.
Do you see that's not really credible?
It was closed down at an appropriate moment.
Okay. You see, it's very difficult for servicemen and women out there, and this isn't about me. This is about, as my role, holding you to account. For servicemen and women out there, what you've just said there is entirely not credible. Overlay that with asking DGEP, who have done this process, to suddenly reverse turn their thinking and think we're now going to protect servicemen and women, is equally not credible.
How on earth can the Permanent Secretary at the MOD come up with answers like that and profess to be credible in front of service personnel, past, present, or even future? Because obviously the recruitment thing is an issue here with this. Trying to take the defence scene as a whole here in Britain. We're now going to listen to Ruth Jones MP putting a question to James Heafy, Junior Minister of Defence. And in that clip, we see a lot of the language that Theresa May used in her government, talking about collective security and cooperation. Let me decode that for you. What that actually means is European Defence Union. Whenever security is mentioned as a whole, it's a huge umbrella word that encompasses defence and security. And the relevance of this cannot be understated, because the existing bilateral agreements and the multilateral agreements that Britain already has in place, that's E3, EI2, the D10, obviously all these acronyms, you can go and Google them. There is a plethora of defence agreements that frame Defence Union, the key pillar of which is NATO. Now, James Heafy uses exactly the same language that Theresa May used to use, clearly under the height of the Sedwell term of office as head of national security. But we see him reiterating, and the key point is that the defence and security work is carrying on regardless of Brexit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We want a relationship with the EU based on friendly cooperation between sovereign equals centred on free trade. We are developing plans to ensure the critical work of defence continues regardless of the outcome of the negotiations.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What discussions exactly has the Minister had with counterparts in the EU to discuss how the UK can, where it's in our interest, continue to cooperate with Member States to further our collective security?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole ministerial team talks to our counterparts across Europe regularly, not just in the context of Brexit, but in the context of our bilateral and multilateral cooperations through a whole series of organisations and fora. That work will continue whatever the outcome of the Brexit negotiations.
Listening to James Heafy and Ben Wallace, you'd think it was a given that Britain was going into European Defence Union, albeit in silence, and as in their own words, regardless of Brexit, as the negotiations on defence and security are being conducted totally separately. So whether Dominic Cummings and David Frost look at this in the future negotiation? I don't know. I would love to know. But conducting the defence review now under Mark Sedwell before he leaves in September makes no sense to me whatsoever. So we bring in the big ticket items here, the special nuclear contract with America, our nuclear weapons, the submarines, and Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, even before he was a presidential candidate, stated openly that NATO was dead. What exactly was he talking about? Was it just a case of that Europe had decided to spend and manage defence differently under defence union, so therefore why would they pay in and go along the NATO road? Or was it the lawfare, as General Petraeus talked about? Because the two countries, or the would-be country in the case of the EU, are going to be fighting under completely different legal frameworks. Caught in the middle of this is our beloved veterans, because that trap between the two has left them falling between the great. So we look back to this long-standing policy since 1957 that Duncan Sandys brought in with building aircraft on a pan-EU basis. But that policy clearly now was not just the industry. It's the very military itself that we would be doing defence on a pan-EU basis, not as a nation. So what we can see there is that whether it was apparent or not, British defence and security policy since 1957 has not been as a nation. It's been to do it on a pan-EU basis. So when we look at all the senior service people that have said about defence cuts year after year when they've come in, or whether that's been post a review, when large quantities of our capital assets have been cut and our personnel have been cut, capital budgets, operational budgets, it wasn't really cutting, was it? It was unification. And regardless of what those officers said at the time, it wasn't listened to because the underlying policy was there. No MPs have really got to grips with this, and this is the key, is that the British veterans now actually collectively hold the balance of power. 4 million veterans, friends and family, amounts to 10, 12 million people. Will they subscribe to doing defence and security on an EU basis, under defence union, single point command and control of all defence and security services from Brussels? That's capital and operational budgets will eventually come under EU control if it carries on. Bearing in mind, Ursula von der Leyen has already stated she wants one single European defence contractor. So as you can see, it's not just the military and the industry, it's an all-encompassing policy. And no doubt Mr. Trump is fully aware of that. This isn't just about Dennis Hutchings being pursued for an attempted murder charge. It's way bigger than that. It's the future of Her Majesty's Armed Services and British defence industry. Good night.